Thank you for your presence this evening. Let's see if we can work on the house lights so we can see a little bit better with the screen. We have some exciting things that we want to show you this evening. Most people recognize that the story of the Ark has been one of the atheist favorite objects of ridicule for a number of years. Christians know that if they affirm faith in the literal story, that many people will snicker and not accept what they're saying. I want to affirm that the answer to the question you may have seen on the signs throughout this area is that, yes, it is real, and I think we can demonstrate that. And it's encouraging to find out how many people in the nation have agreed with that and understand that it is a real story. AOL did a survey, they're not friends of creationists, several years ago, asking the question, do you believe Noah's Ark exists? And notice this question is not, is it a true story, but does it exist now? And I was amazed that 78% of their respondents said yes, they did, and only 22% said no. Well, AOL didn't like that, and so they printed the responses. Every one of the responses that they printed was extremely negative. One of them was, when they're done in Turkey, they go find Excalibur, Santa Claus, and catch some pixies. The story is not literal, it's a myth. To deny that fact is to deny the purpose and value of the Bible. That's amazing. But wouldn't that make them, so if you believe in the story of the Ark, you're a heretic. Desperately looking for any shred of evidence that will prove an old folks' tale. That's retarded. We hear these responses, and I'm amazed, especially by those who claim to be believers, claim to be Christians who just don't believe the Old Testament. That's a myth. And you'd be amazed at how many take that position. Retarded if you believe the story of the Ark. Well, let's think of that in terms of the statement Jesus made in Matthew 24 when he says the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. I don't think he's retarded. But he believes that there were days of Noah and that his coming is going to be like that. Peter expressed it this way in 2 Peter 3. They deliberately suppress this fact here from the New English Translation. The world existing at that time was destroyed when it was deluged with water. If you believe the Bible, you have to acknowledge that that's a fact. And yet so many say, well, yeah, I believe the New Testament. I believe in Christ, but I don't believe all those myths of the Old Testament. That's a completely untenable position. There are 165 references in the New Testament to the book of Genesis. 100 passages from the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, and 63 references to chapters 1 through 3. The very first part of the creation, Adam and Eve, and then 14 passages that refer to chapters 6 through 8, which are the flood chapters. 14 references in the New Testament to chapters 6 through 8, the flood chapters of Genesis. They reference, that is, the New Testament references each one of the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and each author in the New Testament references at least one of the first 11 chapters, and Christ referenced each of the first 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, each of the first 7 chapters of Genesis. Now, how in the world can you say you believe in Christ, you believe the New Testament, but you don't accept the Old? That just won't fly, will it? If you claim to be a Christian, then of course this answer should be obvious. Many acknowledge this and still at the same time say, but but it was a local flood. It only involved the Mesopotamian Valley. The Black Sea overflowed, and a lot of people died. And so the next issue we have to deal with is whether or not it was a global flood. And again, if you believe the Bible, then you really have no choice. There are at least 30 universal terms describing the flood in the flood chapters. Everywhere, all, every, are terms that are used throughout this section. For example, Genesis 7:19, the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that most of the mountains were, no, all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Now, if he's trying to say it covered all the mountains, how would you say it any better than that? Verse 23, he blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, or the land. And notice that qualifying phrase. You didn't need fish on the ark, did you? A lot of things that wouldn't have been on the ark. The ocean covers 70% of the earth's surface, and so that's a lot of animals that wouldn't be there. But every living thing on the face of the ground was involved. And then he says only Noah was left together with those that were with him in the ark. And of course there weren't very many people in Mesopotamian Valley, and they were the only ones that died. And so, yeah, Noah was left, but they all. How many people were there at the time of the flood? It's been about 2,500 years if you follow the Septuagint rendition from the creation to the flood, and many people would think, well, that it wouldn't be long enough to produce much of a population. Maybe you've seen some of these books about the population bomb, and there are a lot of exaggerations, but at the same time, I think population dynamics are dramatically in favor of the young earth and will not work at all for the old earth. Genesis 6 and verse 11 says the earth was filled with violence as the reason for the flood. It doesn't sound like the Mesopotamian Valley, but how many people were there? We can do some calculations. 2 people, creation to the flood. The formula for predicting that you'll find in calculus textbooks or pre-calculus. It looks complicated, and we won't go into detail there. But you have to know the growth rate in order to apply this formula. And in the U.S., it's really, really slowed down. Third world countries, you'll have 4%. We have less than 1%, 0.81 last year in 2017. But 2,500 years, 0.81. Let's not use the average or what we see probably would have been the case prior to the flood, where they lived much longer and had more children. Let's just take what we've got now, which is a very slow rate. Using that formula, how many people would we have in 2,500 years? Just over 1 billion souls. And that's at a very, very slow rate. I don't think that was all in the Mesopotamian Valley. And of course, it really hits home when you think of the majority argument that we hear so often. Everybody thinks this, well, yeah, there were a lot of people that were wrong, and there were 8 people that were saved. And people will say, well, God wouldn't judge that many people. But he did. And that's a serious thought. Another evidence for the universal nature of the flood is seen in Genesis 9 when he talks about his bow, the rainbow, a covenant between me and the earth. Never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. And of course, there never has been a local flood since then. Has there? Lots of local floods. That's not what he was talking about. What he was talking about was absolutely unique and has not happened since then, and he's not talking about a local flood. Another line of evidence involves flood traditions, as they're referred to, from around the world. And those who study this, the anthropologist will tell you there are at least 200 of them that have been documented. 59 from North America, that is, the Sioux Indians had their tradition and the Eskimos had their traditions. 46 from Central America, Central and South America. 31 from Europe, 17 from the Middle East, 23 from Asia, and 37 from the Pacific Islands and Australia. And some will say, well, of course, everybody has floods from time to time, and this is a part of their remembrance, and they've exaggerated, but they did it everywhere, all around the world. And while these stories are not precisely the same, the core of each of the stories is that there was a great flood that destroyed the world, and in a boat, a vessel, 8 people saved the world and the population of animals. And sometimes they'll talk about the birds and specifically which birds, but the details are there, and certainly the core in all of these. I was in the outback in Australia and bought a boomerang from one of the artisans there, and saw the carvings, asked what that was, and they said, this is the story of the flood. And they had a different name for the hero of the story, but there were 8 people, and here were animals. They don't have many floods in the outback, you know. But somewhere in their memory, I think there was a common memory, an account of in all of these instances. 200 separate accounts. Another line of evidence involves seashells on mountaintops. And I know how geologists try to explain that. It doesn't work, and if you have questions about that, I can explain why. But right up on top of Mount Everest, you see seashells. Now that's just some real irony there. When we study the geologic column, as represented here, supposed to represent the evolution of life through time, right down at the bottom you have the beginning of the geologic column. That's what you find up at the top of Mount Everest, the Cambrian and Ordovician fossils. It's like God sticking his tongue out saying, na, 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 na. Right on top of Mount Everest, I'm going to put the bottom of the geologic column. We've spent a good bit of time on Mount Ararat in the past 10 years, and we have collected a number of seashells. You can see some of them up here on the table, from Mount Ararat. These were collected in 2013 at well over a mile up, 7,800. How do you get seashells on top of mountains like this? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious. Another obvious indication to a geologist especially would be the pillar lava. And even Wikipedia understands the implications. Pillar lavas are lavas that contain characteristic pillar shapes, structures that are attributed to the extrusion of lava underwater. If you find it, it happened underwater. This is the shape that is produced when it is underwater. Pillar lavas are generally used to confirm subaqueous volcanism. And I'm sitting here on the pillar lavas at over 8,000 feet. This one was specifically 8,200. Now, it's not soft, but we were posing here, one of my favorite pictures. And if you look for pillar lava in the geology textbooks, I think I can guarantee you won't find a picture this good. It's a great picture of pillar lava, and you can see the split rock with the concentric circles clearly indicating the pillar structure. Further up the mountain, here at 12,200 feet, there it is, and I found it up to 14. And here is a whole field of the pillars which were formed underwater, according to all the geologists. I think the global extent of the layers, which many geologists, most perhaps, would say were formed by a flood of some sort. I had one of my professors say, the best explanation for the geologic column is 10,000 local floods. I think there's a simpler way to explain that. But some of these layers that are continuous with the same fossils, the same stuff in it, same consistency, goes around the globe and thousands of miles. Now, what you're hearing right now is a condensed version, about 10 minutes of a 1-hour lecture that I often do on the evidence of from geology for the flood. So we're hitting the high spots. I'd be glad to fill in on that if you have more questions. I think we can show all kinds of evidence then for the fact that it was real and that it was global, and that there's really good evidence for it. It was real. But then we hear people saying, but there's no way you could get all of those animals on that little bitty boat. And I said, well, how big was the boat? Well, I don't know, but you couldn't get all the animals on it. Well, how many animals were there? I don't know, but you couldn't get them all on the little bitty boat. And they have not figured that, but they're sure that you couldn't get all the animals. Bill Nye, the science guy, has made some rather snide remarks about that and saying that we need a bigger boat. But his response calculates numbers of animals that always include fishes and corals. Ernst Mayr came up with a list like this. Bill Nye was similar. Here you got 1 million species, and that would be a challenge, except what's wrong with that? Fishes, sponges, they don't need to be on the ark, do they? When you eliminate the ones that live in the ocean, which is 70% of the Earth's surface, you got mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians. And of course, some of them live in the ocean, but let's use this as a way to calculate. That's a total of 17,600 species, not kinds. Kinds, if you study the way it's used, especially in Leviticus, is a much broader category, probably closer to family than to species. But using species to give us an outside maximum and multiplying times 2, we'd have 35,000. A lot of animals have become extinct, and so let's just be as generous as we can and say, well, we got half as many as we used to have, which of course is a downhill process, not uphill. So we double it to allow for extinction. And then, of course, you got clean animals. There were 7 each of those, not very many of them, but just really exaggerating, let's allow for 5,000 clean animals, which would give you an outside maximum of 75,000. Now, I don't think there's any reasonable way to get beyond that. That's stretching it. If you have a more reasonable estimate, you'd be talking about kinds instead of species, which is probably half of the 5,000. Some of our experts in creation science and biology have indicated that, but let's use, I think, a generous number for kinds times 2, doubling for extinction. 1,000 clean animals is a much more reasonable estimate, so you're looking at a maximum there of about 21,000. So somewhere between 75 and 21,000 would be a reasonable estimate. Well, do you have room for that on the ark? Well, not if you're thinking about the kind of vessel that a lot of people think about. Playing around in the bathtub with this leaves a false impression sometimes. I think it looked more like this. And yes, we do see dinosaurs going up the gangplank. The average dinosaur that we'll get to that in just a moment. It wouldn't have had to have been the big Seismosaurus, which I think was the great-great-grandpa, up to 177 feet long. Would have been room for him, but I don't think that's what was chosen. I think he was the great-grandfather rather than the teenager, which would be more reasonable. A juvenile form would certainly help reproduce. The average size dinosaur is not as big as most people think. We're impressed with the big ones, Many of them were chicken size and even smaller. But according to PLOS, recently the average adult dinosaur was the size of a bison. We've got about 50 kinds of dinosaurs, and so if you got room for 50 pairs of bisons, you've got plenty of room for the dinosaurs on the Ark. Well, how big was the Ark? I think we have real good reason to believe it's 21 inches. It varies from 18 to 36 historically. Don't have time to tell you why, but right now, let's just go with 21, which is certainly within the range. That would make a vessel 525 feet long, not quite 2 football fields. Are you thinking of a vessel that long, that big? As high as a 5-story building. Now that's much larger than most people imagine. That'd be well over 2 million cubic feet, which, of course, everybody grasps and has a conception of, or probably not. It's the equivalent of 750 railroad cars. That might be a little easier to visualize. And how many animals you put on a railroad car? Well, if you think of horses and cows, they're really big animals you often ship on railroad cars. Not as many, of course, as with smaller. The average size of the animal, according to the statistical analysis, is about the size of a cat. And there are many more smaller animals, the shrews and the mice. But you don't normally ship cats across the country in railroad cars, so it's kind of hard to get a handle on that. You do ship sheep across the country in railroad cars, and that's, of course, considerably bigger than a cat. So generously estimating, we use 240 sheep, which is the standard for a railroad car when you're shipping it across the country today. Using the sheep much larger than the average, you're talking about 180,000 animals, 750 times 240, easy to calculate. And that's when you are equating the kind with species using a multiplying factor, the splitters, doubling for extinction and doubling the average size. Only 75,000 were needed at an outside maximum, and we have a capacity for 180,000. So where's the problem here? All of them are accommodated using these maximum parameters in 42% of the Ark's capacity. If you use more reasonable conclusions, 5,000 kinds, which is probably twice as much as the real number, then we're looking at 12% of the Ark's capacity. It begins to get ridiculous to say this is not possible. Maybe you've got all the animals on the bottom floor, a third, and the food on the second floor, and you just drop it down to them. Mr. and Ms. Noah could have the whole top deck to themselves. In fact, they could have a regulation-sized football field on the top floor and still have room for all the animals up to watch. Now, I think we're the ones that need to be doing the ridiculing, rather than those who've never put the pencil to it, don't know how many animals, don't know how big the boat is, but they're sure. That's what's ridiculous. There are lots of ingenious objections that have been raised. A friend of mine, John Woodmarappy, has researched these for the past 20, 30 years. Actually, he's researched the objections that have been made for the past 100 years. They're all listed in this book, Noah's Ark, a feasibility study, and he's got the answers. And if you got one you hadn't heard an answer to, I can pretty well assure you it's in there and he's got an answer. So I would refer you to that if you have further questions. Let's move to a different question. And we do need to emphasize that it is a different question. First, it is a feasible story. It does make sense. But could it still be there? Totally different question. Well, a lot of kooks think they found it. Here's one that thinks it's on Mars. Somebody thought they found it in Iraq under Saddam's palace. don't think so. And others, perhaps sounding more reasonable, would say, but wood couldn't last 4,500 years. That's not possible. Now you go to an archaeological museum and they'll have things 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, and most people don't bat an eye. But the Ark 45, no way. Well, we look at things like the Pharaonic sunboat, which was found at the foot of Cheops, the Great Pyramid, and they tell us that's 4,500 years old, which would be how far back the flood is. I doubt if it's that old, but close, maybe 4,000. And it's in great shape. It's not only in good shape, it's held together by ropes, and the ropes are in good shape. So what's the problem? It's not the kinds of problems that you hear people saying when they haven't really researched it and thought about it. Another factor that would help preserve it, of course, is the fact that it was covered inside and without with pitch, which I suspect was a resin. This picture may give us an idea, but we have some problems. What's wrong with the picture? Pitch is black, isn't it? How many of you have seen a black ark? I don't know why people don't grasp that. It's covered with pitch, and of course that is an excellent preservative. It was made of gopher wood. What in the world is that? Well, we don't know. That's the real answer. But there are some ancient manuscripts which have given an indication that this is not really a species of wood. It's probably a type of construction, more like plywood or laminated wood. And just thinking along those lines, and of course we don't know, if gopher is laminated wood, it'd be like some of these laminated beams, and many times you have spans up to and over 500 feet supported by laminated beams. This is from Wikipedia, not that they are that great a source, but if they know it, then it's not that rare a knowledge. Pound for pound stronger than steel, has greater strength and stiffness, soaring arches for domed roofs spanning more than 500 feet, much longer spans, heavier loads, more complex shapes, that is, than steel. Resin glues, which are inexpensive, easy to use, is completely waterproof. Sounds like that would solve a lot of problems, not only helping to preserve, but some of the physical challenges that some imagine. It could last 4,500 years easily in this condition. In fact, Nature reported on some Chinese noodles recently that were 4,000 years old. If the noodles, not in pitch, were preserved, I don't think we'd have much problem with the Ark, especially if it's frozen a good bit of the time. There are problems, and we've had a number in the research that involve politics. Turkey, of course, is where the Ark is located, eastern Turkey, almost to Armenia and Iran, right over in that corner. Now, that's where you have a war zone, and it's been a war zone for the past 30 years. There's 40,000 people that have been killed in the war between the Kurds and the Turks, and these are the rebel Kurds there. And it sometimes can be a very dangerous situation. To give you an idea of where this is, note that I'm standing here with my back to Iran and taking a picture standing just about the same spot in the other direction. We're looking across the border directly at the Ark from Iran. You go north into Armenia. The capital is Yerevan, and standing right there in the middle of the capital, you can see Mount Ararat, which is very much a part of the heritage of the people in Armenia. This is not a real nice spot. About 150 miles from Syria, where the war is raging. As we go back in history, we do find that a lot of historians mention the Ark and that it had been seen, and I wish we had time to review all of that. One of the more one of the better known historians would be Josephus, a first century Jewish historian. He says, all the writers of barbarian histories make mention of this flood and this ark. Now, if you're not Jewish, you're barbarian in his view, and that includes all of them. He mentions 6 historians particularly, and says the land also possesses the remains of the ark, remains which to this day are shown to those who are curious to see them. So in his day, in the first century, there was no contest. Everybody, all the historians were confirming that it was there and people were going to see it. But those accounts dwindled, and within 100 years you don't hear more of that, and do not reoccur until about 1840, when there was a huge earthquake on Mount Ararat, opening a gash in the side, a Shanadair. And from that point, you have quite a few, about 25 credible accounts, 4 in particular that we'll take time to look at, beginning with Georgi Hagopian, who was living at the foot of the mountain as an Armenian back in 1904. And he and his family made regular treks up the mountain, he says, to see it. And he went up with his uncle that year. And we've checked the weather records. That's one of the hottest years on record. And at the end of the summer, when the ice had melted back, they were able to see it, working with that commercial artist that was standing with him, Alfred Lee. They drew this picture, which is not anything like the old master paintings. It's more like a barge, which is not designed to go places, but to carry things, or at least more than the ships. And it always wondered about the single window. How could that work? The King James says it was finished 1.5 cubits upward. And looked at that picture and, well, okay, now I can see that makes sense, especially if you have a covering over it that was removed before they exited. That would keep the water from coming in but allow the ventilation. Another view of it looked like this. You could see the window going the length of it. That's very similar to a picture that was drawn as a result of the photograph taken by Mr. Autumov. He was one of the Russian soldiers that was dispatched by the Tsar about 1917 up Mount Ararat. Aviators had seen the vessel sticking out of the glacier. The Tsar says, we need to go see about that. And he sent 43 soldiers. Autumov was one of them. They spent, he says, about 2 months up there photographing, measuring. They entered it and came back down. While they were up there, the Bolshevik Revolution took place. The Tsar was killed. Most of the clerics in the land were killed, and they came down with pictures of the Ark, which put them in danger. Most of them were killed. He escaped, along with 3 others that he knows of, to America. He came to Oklahoma City and was an engineer there for a number of years. We've talked to his nephew, who has seen the photograph that he took, promised that we would see it, but we have some very promising young men around sometimes. That has not materialized, but he did draw a sketch for us. He was threatened by people that live up on the mountain, some of the Kurds, who have as their purpose in life to protect the Ark from the eyes of the infidel. The Quran indicates this is where Muhammad is supposed to return if they keep it pure. And so they have killed a number of people and threatened to kill him, so he hasn't shown that photograph, but he did draw this sketch of it. George Green was there in the early 50s, about 52, petroleum geologist tracing oil formations with a helicopter and flying over the mountain, not looking for the Ark, not religious. In fact, didn't know what all he was photographing until he got back home and showed the photographs to his friends. They were asking what this mountain is, Mount Ararat. Green didn't understand, but the ears perked up up on the friends? Ararat. Well, and then they looked and said, wow, what's that sticking out of the glacier? And it wasn't long after that that Green was dispatched down to South America, where he was murdered. He had told several about the photographs. Earl Cummings, an art researcher, had seen it, or at least had seen the sketches that were drawn by the friends, had published. The word got out, and they did come after him and threw him out of the 6-story window of the hotel, landed in the swimming pool below, killed. The only thing missing from his hotel room were the pictures. But the sketch that was drawn by those who had shown the pictures to back in Albuquerque is seen here, similar to the others. One more we'll show you from Ed Davis, who was there in 43. He was with the Army Corps of Engineers. He saved the life of one of the Kurdish village chieftain's grandsons, and as an act of hospitality and gratitude, which they do believe in, offered to take him up at the end of the summer and show him the Ark, which he was anxious to do. He wasn't able to get exactly to it, but was within 50 yards of it, he says, and with his Army field glasses could see the 3 decks. At this point, it had broken. This is 1943, and I have interviewed him at length and listened to him over a period of days describe exactly what he saw. And we would show a picture, and he would recognize the spot in the picture and then tell us what was over here that wasn't in the picture. We knew it was there. Obviously, he was there, and the story rang true. He worked with Alfred Lee to help draw what he was seeing, and came up with the picture of the 2 pieces that you see here that are broken. More recently, this painting depicts that drawing and the 2 pieces that were split. Now, since 43, the ice has built up at this point, and there are places on Earth where it is, instead of receding. And it just so happens that in 1943, in Greenland, World War II airplanes were abandoned on the ice. They left them, and ice has been building up there. And they eventually found them just a few years ago, covered with 260 feet of ice since they were abandoned 50 years earlier. They drilled down through the ice, very interesting apparatus that we're interested in. But several books have been written about it, several TV programs. They actually were able to recover one of these World War II airplanes, pulling them out piece by piece, reassembling it and flying it. It's now in Texas. But the ice had built up 260 feet. Over here where Ed Davis had seen the 2 pieces, it appears that there is 90 feet of ice that's built up from the center of the deepest part of that valley. However, at the upper portion of this ark, it's only about 36 feet from the tip down from the surface of the ice, and that's what we've been interested in. We'd like to melt it. You know, where's Al Gore when you need him? It's going the opposite direction here, but we did dig down through the ice at that spot, as we'll see. Our project director, and let me introduce you to our crew, Dick Bright. He has climbed the mountain 36 times and probably knows more about the mountain and the research than any man on earth. Dr. Randall Price has his PhD in archaeology from the University of Texas. He is professor of Judaic Studies at Liberty University today. And then Dr. John Bryant has his PhD from Texas A&M. He's a geophysicist. He's licensed as an engineer, a geologist, a geophysicist, and a cartographer. Makes maps. And he runs marathons and climbs mountains. And good fellow to have on the team. Another part of the team is one who has access to classified satellite material. We can't tell a whole lot about it, but it's a microwave technology that can see under the ice from the satellite. He is, best we can determine, teaches spy school in Albuquerque. kid him somewhat about, but he has been able to see under the ice, and that's been very helpful. At the spot indicated here, we've got the summit, and then right over here in the circle on the left is the Ed Davis Valley. And with that satellite, he can see exactly what Ed Davis saw, the two pieces. And so that's where we were investigating. This is the way the mountain looks from the base. It doesn't look 3.5 miles high, does it? We're looking at this spot. That's the Ed Davis Valley, 3.5 miles up. That's a whole lot further than anything we have in the contiguous U.S. To give you an idea of the route, notice the little yellow line coming up down at the bottom and the little white dot maybe you can see at the end. That's 10,500, and I talk to people who think, boy, they got up to 10,000. That's really high. You just hardly started good here. This is where a good bit of the war is going on, and we see, places where we're in the ditch dodging bullets and can see the vehicles that are bombed and burned that we have to go around on the way up. From that campsite, very easily, see how the arrow goes up? It's much more difficult than that when you're climbing. And the little white dots at the end are at about 14,000. That's about as high as mountains get in a contiguous U.S. Pikes Peak's 14.4. This is a very interesting picture, I think, at that site. One of the Kurds helping us carry material up the mountain is thanking Allah for his safe trip with the rainbow in the background. This is our really comfortable campsite. Not so comfortable when you realize all of those rocks have come from above and continue to tumble down, and you can hear it all night long. You look down from that site and you really can't see down. It's under the clouds. And then look up from that site and you can't see up either. This is the rolling, tumbling rocks that you have to traverse, and they roll often like logs in the water. I stepped on one and it rolled and had a serious accident that had required me going down and having my head sewed up, and did get a very professional head bandage, as you can see. And then climb back up to that campsite. We acclimate about 3 days at that point, and then head on up over the top, and then another hour and a half. But you can see the arrows going up showing the path. Once you get up on the glacier, you have a much more difficult time. Now, 17,000 is there's no air up there. It's not a fun place. You do have to watch for the glaciers once you get, that is the crevasses, once you get on the glacier. Very dangerous. And from the drawing on the right, you can see sometimes it's not visible, but you have a very dangerous crevasse underneath. If you fall down, that's pretty much over. And sometimes that's exactly the way it looks as we're walking along. Here, you can see the crevasse in the background or up in the front part of it, but here where the hole is in the foreground, that was not visible. But that's where Kevin, our alpinist who was leading on a rope, went down through the crevasse. We didn't have those signs there, but that's where he fell through. He did, of course, we were roped together, and so we were able to pull him back up. But while he was dangling down there, he did have the presence of mind to take some pictures, which we appreciate. And then we climb up and keep trekking. Some very dangerous circumstances, whiteouts all night long, very lethal circumstances. It looks pretty and nice, but it's about 20 below. 80-mile-an-hour winds are not unusual. This is the summit, which we've finally reached. That's not really the purpose of the climb, but it's kind of nice, I guess, to get there. It is my certain conviction that people that climb mountains for fun are nuts. I got to have a real good reason to get up there. But we go on then another hour and a half over to the Head Davis Valley. And this is the dig site, that spot where we believe that that ark was about 40 feet under that spot. The first night it was pretty bad. 80-mile-an-hour winds were measured. Cowboy, one of our helpers there, is from Texas, who insists on his cowboy hat no matter how the wind's blowing. Had a hard time getting out. Dr. Price had an even harder time. But once you get ice over the tent, actually that insulates and doesn't make as much racket. But the next night it got really bad. The wind gauge broke at 100 miles an hour. The top of a mountain is just not a real nice place to be in a tent. It did shred many of the tents. I can highly recommend North Face. They're wind tunnel tested at 100 miles an hour, and mine held together. Dick's did not. He's our director. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, one of the Kurds came to me and unzipped my tent and stuck his head in trying to communicate. And I didn't understand him. I didn't really want to. And finally he said, "Dick," which communicated. I understood he was in trouble, and he was in the third stage of hypothermia. His tent had been shredded. This is the way he looked when we got there. He was in obviously bad shape. I drug him into my tent, put him in a sleeping bag, and he was still alive the next morning, so we took him down. I was told that I probably should have climbed in the bag with him. I said, nope, he's just going to have to die. We're not going to go there. We had some very sophisticated detection equipment, side scanning radars, and dragging these things across the ice in a grid. We were able to get some information of what was below the ice. Electrical resistivity experiments were also run. And this is Dr. Bryant, who, and notice the battery there beside him, that didn't walk up the mountain by itself. That has to be carried along with all of this equipment. He was able then to communicate with our own hotspot back to his office in Dallas, crunch the numbers, send them back, and give us feedback. One of the major problems we had involved the GPS signals that were scrambled as a part of the war effort. And that has become a serious problem. It's called spoofing, and some of you may be familiar with it, but if you can confuse the enemy's GPS signal, then he has a hard time finding out where he is and where he wants to go. But that was going on the mountain, and we would record as we're doing the grid one spot in the ice in the evening, come back the next morning to drill 1 meter to the south, and it says 75 meters to the south. And we know we got problems, and we set up the dig tent over the spot that we could best determine. This is a large tent that allows us to be out of the weather 24/7 and continue the dig. We had designed an apparatus that would suspend the block and tackle so that we could cut up the blocks of ice and lift them out. We drilled with an auger and seemed to have hit something very hard down at about 34 feet. So we began to dig. We chopped up with chainsaws into 1-foot blocks and began to pull them out with the block and tackle. And I can tell you that's hard work, especially up there where there's no air. And at the bottom where there's lots of fumes, with the chainsaws. Of course, we have the ventilation shafts that you can see there as well. But that was a major undertaking and a major disappointment when we got to the bottom and didn't find what we were expecting. I'd call your attention to the nature of the ice that we're in. One of the objections, and reasonable objections that people make, is that if you're looking for something in a glacier, that's really not reasonable, because glaciers move down a mountain and move like a tractor tread, and they just grind up everything in it. And you go to 99% of the glaciers in the world, they're just full of rocks that they have collected as they're moving. This is not like that. This is in a bowl, and it's not moving, and you do not find anything in it. It's just like digging in an ice cube. But this very hardy young man is very disappointed at this point. We had, from satellite telemetry that we got from the Turks, which perhaps had somewhat of an advantage. Our satellite was geosynchronous, directly overhead all the time. Theirs was not, but coming across, it would have different angles that would read as it went across the horizon. Probably better at locating and fighting the spoofing. And they indicated that we had missed it by about 8 meters. And so it was suggested we use the auger to drill where the Turkish satellite indicated, and we did. And it did bring up some debris, unlike what we had seen in the other drilling spots. Was it wood? Well, it certainly looked possible. So I took the pieces back down the mountain to the laboratory in the hospital in Dolgobasit and used their microscope. Would you like to see what we saw? I'm going to show you anyway, but it's all right. I found it extremely exciting. The satellite said, this is where you should find it. Well, the first one was spoofed, but this one evidently was right on. So we sent word back, you need to drill more. And so they did. It was too late. There's about a 2-month window when the weather gets too bad and you have to leave. So August for up to the first part of middle of September, and you have to leave. Well, we were nearing that end of that window. We didn't have time to dig another hole, but we could use the auger, and the auger will go down in about 30 minutes. They got a number of pretty good-sized chunks from the auger in the drilling that followed. I had told them clearly to wrap it in foil, protect it. Either they didn't understand or didn't understand the importance. They just shoved the ice, the debris, into a fruit jar. When they brought it down, it was floating in the muddy water, which is obviously contaminated. But we're looking at wood with pitch on it. I think that's exciting. We wanted to get to it with the hole, and I think we could, but at this point, this is all we had, and it was time to leave. Think with me before we conclude this evening about the implications. Obviously, a local flood is not going to explain something 3.5 miles high. You can't have a 3-mile or a 2-mile high local flood. That's absurd. And if you have a vessel of this size on that mountain, that is obvious evidence of a worldwide supernatural judgment. And I don't know that there's any way around that. We've been debating the geologist for 100 years about the sedimentary rock that covers the continents to an average depth of about 1.5 miles. They say that happened as a result of a slow, gradual buildup. We say, no, it was a rapid, high-energy, catastrophic flood deposit. 1.5 miles, water-laid rock covering the continents with billions and billions of dead things in it. Well, we find the vessel 3 miles up this is a flood deposit, and they lose. This is the preferred explanation, obviously, and the implications are really hard to imagine. Gilbert Grosvenor was the first editor of National Geographic. He said the discovery of Noah's Ark would be the greatest archaeological